He's been listed among names including Steve Jobs, Christine Lagarde, George Soros, and Tim Geithner. 35-year-old Carson Block rose to prominence only in the past year after his report that Sinoforest overstated its assets, precipitating a plunge in the stock. Investors, including John Paulson, were forced to sell their Sinoforest shares at a loss. Bloomberg Markets has named Carson Block one of the 50 most influential people in finance. He is the founder of Muddy Waters Research, and he joins us right here in New York. Carson, it is good to see you after speaking to you so many times on the phone, on camera. Here you are finally. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty, but the first thing I wanted to ask you, has the notoriety that you've attracted as a result of your calls, very prescient calls on stocks like Sinoforest, made it easier or harder for you to do your work?
Well, there are two sides to that coin. On one hand, there are more people who reach out to me and discuss more ideas, but on the other hand, my days of doing field work in China and really looking under the hood of some of these companies myself, those are obviously over.
What about some of these scandals, Carson, that are popping up right across China, but companies that list in our markets here egocentrically, right? Toronto, New York. How many more do you think we're going to hear about?
Wow, that's a tough question. I do get asked that a lot. I think the problem is somewhat self-correcting. Right now, we're seeing that a lot of valuations of these Chinese stocks have the valuations have collapsed in many cases, and I think the companies that are not reporting honest financials, they'll sort of go away in many instances. But those that are, I think they'll stay around, and yeah, I don't know how many more big scandals we'll have. This could just sort of be a gradual deflation of this problem.
Well, you know better than anybody that you have to do your homework if you're going to expose a fraud. It is not easy, even if you feel as though it is staring you in the face. Are these companies making it more difficult now for you to obtain the information that you need? They are in China to begin with, which isn't exactly the world's most open and transparent country. Do you find it more difficult, or is the fraud maybe conversely just getting easier to spot?
Well, sure, companies do appear to be taking preemptive measures. We suspect that some companies have gone back and substituted forged files in some of their Chinese government filings. So that can make it harder. But on the other hand, when you have an instance where it's clearly a forgery, that's something that raises a lot of doubts about the company itself. In terms of looking at their operations, yes, some of them are on alert, but we just have to raise our game.
So, Carson, just out of curiosity, I know I don't want to paint with a broad brush or ask you to do so, but is there any pattern that you see about Chinese companies listing elsewhere, listing in Hong Kong, for example, New York, Toronto? Does that automatically pique your curiosity?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things that has happened a year ago, or just over a year ago, before we came on the scene and other short sellers really started working on these Chinese frauds, in some circles in China, the U.S. markets were a bit of a joke because we were seen as gullible and willing to invest in really anything.
You don't say it, Carson.
Yeah. But I'm very proud to say that today that perception has changed 180 degrees.
You feel personally partly responsible for that?
I think it's fair to say that we share some of the, we should take some of the credit for that. Yeah. And today, those same people seem to be afraid of the U.S. markets because they view American investors, especially short sellers, as aggressive and ready to pounce on any potential impropriety. So they now talk about Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has had a more thorough pre-IPO due diligence process. But the question is, how many problems have slipped through the cracks in Hong Kong? That's something, it's very interesting.
Carson, here's a question for you. Don't you have to be pretty darn careful now about what you say to people like us? I'm thinking, for example, about your comments regarding Silvercorp Metals. This is a company that you haven't actually studied yourself, and at least you haven't published a report on, correct?
We haven't published a report on it.
But you've publicly stated that you've gone short the stock. And the reason I ask you this question is, as you know, there's a big difference between Muddy Waters Research doing its homework, publishing a report that says, for the following reasons, we don't think this is credible or we think this is a fraud, and Muddy Waters Research or Carson Block commenting on somebody else's report. And that's what the case was with Silvercorp.
Okay, and I think this is actually an important question. I'm glad to have the opportunity to clarify something. Consistent with past practices, when we see a report that we think is interesting to our Twitter followers, we'll tweet it. Now, we were also short that name at the time that we tweeted it.
So even in advance of that, the report that was published?
We had been looking at Silvercorp, and it's important for disclosure purposes, for full transparency, that we state that we have a position. So in the past, we have tweeted the existence of reports that others have written, and if we've had a position at the time that we tweeted them, then we have to disclose that. So that wasn't us saying, Muddy Waters is short, you should be short too. This was us saying, this is an interesting report. For full disclosure, we are short.
Okay, because you know what people will say, and what people do say is the moment Carson Block comes out and says, I've got a short position on stock XYZ, they think, oh, Carson Block is short, maybe I need to be short too. If they go short, it only adds fuel, if you will, to your short position, makes you money. Well, look, I mean, people see it as very self-serving. And I understand what you're saying, but you could say that to us as many times as you want, and there are all kinds of people out there who aren't going to believe you.
Sure. If you want to be
because you stand to make money, there's an incentive, right? There's a very strong incentive. And I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying that it's so open to skepticism.
Look, in this situation, it was darned if you do, darned if you don't. But we tend to be more conservative about this from the disclosure and transparency perspective. So if we do mention the name of a company and we have a position in it at the time that we mention it, we believe that we have to explain that we have this position. So it may have, some people may interpret it as us trying to use that to push the stock price, but yeah, at the end of the day, if you want to be popular guy in the markets, you are not going to do this work. You're not going to be a short seller. So
yeah, you have to have a pretty independent outlook and a pretty thick skin as well. But I'm just curious, have you had to hire more lawyers as time has gone on, just to be sure?
Yeah, that kind of joke that I'm fairly lawyered up. Well, yeah, I mean, especially when you're dealing with multi-jurisdictional issues. So with Sinoforest, it was Canadian listed stock, so we had to hire Canadian counsel, and yeah, there are a lot of costs actually to doing this business that people don't really see.
Did you know before you started this kind of work? Did you know about all these just basic costs, as you say, to running your business?
To be honest, when we started this, when we sent the first report out, we didn't even have a business plan. I could not have conceived that Muddy Waters would become as widely known as it is, or that I'd be sitting here at this table a little over a year later as a top 50.
Any chance you take your research outside of China and start to look at potential frauds and short-selling opportunities elsewhere?
There's a very good chance.
Where would you go first? Russia, Brazil,
well,
India? I'm just curious.
I get asked about Russia, and to any Russians who might be watching, Russia's a line that I won't cross. I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, exactly.
Carson, thanks very much.
Doesn't want to end up sitting in a cage in some courtroom somewhere. Carson Block, the founder of Muddy Waters Research.